You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 1st of October 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Turmack. Coming up on today's program.
They call it clean, we call it extremely partisan. Not one discussion, House or Senate, between the two leaders. That is not how you negotiate.
Chuck Schumer, the Democratic Party's leader in the Senate there. It is day one of a U.S. government shutdown. How many days will this one last? And will anyone go to work under the threat of termination and without pay? After that.
It is the next big thing for Boeing. And in that sense, it's kind of them throwing the gauntlet at the feet of Airbus. It's them saying, you know, we've been through this run of crises, but we're not down and out.
The U.S. plane maker Boeing starts planning for a brand new plane as it continues to rebuild trust in the old ones. We'll also get the business headlines and saving the best, most important news to last, the results from finals day of the annual Fat Bear Week contest in Alaska. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Turmack. Happy October, everyone. We will start today's show in the United States, where government shutdowns are becoming about as American as apple pie these days, a regular feature of every recent administration, Republican and Democrat, 21 in total over the last 5 decades, not counting this one. As of today, American federal employees are essentially working for free, with the promise of back pay in theory when Congress can finally agree on a new budget, or at least kick the can down the road by funding the government for another few weeks or months. Well, Jacob Heilbrunn is editor of The National Interest and joins me now from Washington, D.C. Good morning from the U.S. Capitol, or to the U.S. Capitol, Jacob. Do we say happy shutdown day?
No, we do not. It bodes very badly for Washington, D.C., which is already suffering from the draconian cuts in the federal workforce that the Trump administration has enacted in the past months.
It is a good point. I mean, Washington has been through a lot at this point. What is the mood like over there?
The mood is somnolent. People are worried, apprehensive, and even frightened because you're starting to see an exodus from Washington as people search for jobs elsewhere in the country. And is that happening? This is partly happening because of pressure, obviously, from the Trump administration, the exodus. I guess a lot of people have had enough. I mean, how is this going to add to that? There is both the side of this that federal workers are at this point basically working without pay, but there's also this threat that the Trump administration will simply start firing federal workers. Is that real? Yes, because in a way, the shutdown redounds to Trump's benefit, at least initially, because he has no interest in keeping the federal government working. From the beginning, they've been trying to shutter it. So the Democrats are in a very ticklish position.
That is one of the real points that this comes down to, isn't it? Democrats are forcing this shutdown, I guess, in the sense that they feel this is the one place where they have some leverage in Congress because you need 60 votes in a Senate to get a budget passed. Is that reasonable? Is there any point in continuing this if they get the sense that Trump has no interest in caving?
Well, the difficulty for the Democrats is that, to borrow Trump's famous expression, they don't really hold the cards and they're in a bad position. So what can they do? If they pass the budget, they know that Trump will enact what he calls budget rescissions, which is that he will not adhere to any budget deal that is struck. Instead, his head of the Office of Management and Budget, Russ Vought, is unilaterally and retroactively deciding what he wants to spend on. And they're just slashing programs arbitrarily, even if Congress has funded them. So right now, the Democrats are catering to their base. They're becoming more like Republicans. Each side is now dug. It's a bit like World War I. We're in trench warfare.
And each side, if they are catering to their base, and that's what Democrats are doing, how are they doing on that front? Because there are so many gripes that Democrats will have with the current administration. So, I mean, they can only focus on so much, and they seem to have focused in this fight, at least this element of the trench warfare you're describing, on healthcare costs.
Well, it's not a dumb strategy, since the premiums for about 20 million people will start going up in 2 months at between 18 to 20%. And over the next decade, I think 14 million people are predicted to be kicked off Obamacare. Essentially, what Trump has done is not to repeal Obamacare overtly, but to do it in practice. So the Democrats are rebelling against this. How long the Democrats can hold out is an interesting question. I think the shutdown could last for months.
Could it become the longest? Is that one of the predictions? I mean, the last longest was actually also in the first Trump administration.
Easily, each side hates the other.
It's as simple as that. Each side hates the other, but also the politics of it. Does either side feel at this point that there is an interest in ending it, or do they imagine that they both have the public on their side?
They both do have the public on the side, to the extent that the New York Times had a poll yesterday. Trump's ratings are stuck at 43%. 9 out of 10 Republicans believes in him. I don't think the Democrats are going to be unlikely that they'll become any more popular either. The country is polarized. So again, we're back to this World War I scenario where no one has an incentive to budge.
So does that mean anything at all for, say, the midterms coming up in a year? This would seem to be one of those fights that is kind of being had with that in mind.
It's a very volatile situation, because Trump's modus operandi is always to double down. I imagine that he will demand even more concessions from the Democrats to end this stalemate. And he's going to ramp up the military presence in American cities. He's talking about using them as a training ground for the U.S. military. So I predict more, not less, volatility.
I mean, Jacob, it just sounds so strange to hear you say there that it's Trump who's going to demand concessions from Democrats. It should, in theory at least, be the other way around. We're talking here of a government shutdown.
It depends. Trump's government. If the shutdown becomes unpopular, then he'll have the upper hand. Right now, honestly, no one really knows. I mean, it could end up being a pox on both your houses, in which neither side wins, so to speak, this shutdown. Instead, it just becomes an armed truce.
Just finally then, Jacob, I mean, what does this do? Does this do anything, do you imagine, for kind of the reputation of the United States at this point? Government shutdowns are such a regular occurrence. I mean, is it something that people are looking at anymore?
I think it could further raise the borrowing rates. You know, the United States, its credit rating may be downgraded further by Moody's and other financial assessment firms. And I think it confirms for the rest of the world that the United States is becoming an increasingly unstable power, that the system is not functioning, and that the country is headed to some kind of breakdown.
Well, and just finally, Jacob, when it comes to the federal workforce, I mean, as we started with this show in Washington, D.C., do you actually expect people to show up for their jobs? I mean, is there worry there for air traffic control, all the different aspects of this, that people at this point just might not show up?
Well, they'll show up initially, but the earlier shutdown started to crack once the air traffic controller started calling in sick and so forth. There's only so far you can push people. So let's see how long Trump can hold out and how long the Democrats can hold out. Right now, this is going to be a much more bitter and protracted shutdown than the United States has ever experienced.
Trench warfare in Washington. Jacob Heilbrunn, editor of The National Interest out of D.C. Thank you very much for joining us. And now here's Tom Webb with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Israel has continued its destruction of Gaza with at least 23 people killed in attacks since dawn. The continuous bombardment of Gaza City follows Hamas's acceptance of a United States ceasefire plan to end the 2-year war, which now remains uncertain. Trains, buses and taxis in Greece are all disrupted today as part of a 24-hour strike against changes to labour laws. Under the new regulations, working hours that include overtime would be capped at 48 hours per week, with a maximum 150 overtime hours allowed per year. Japan Airlines has submitted a series of preventative measures to the Transport Ministry to curb future violations of pilots drinking on the job. It means 6 pilots will be removed from duty who were flagged as at risk concerning alcohol consumption. The captains had been drinking during a layover in Hawaii, which substantially delayed 3 flights. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Tom. The U.S. plane maker Boeing, in the middle of a recovery plan after a string of high-profile accidents and incidents, is apparently beginning to develop for the future. A successor to Boeing's troubled 737 MAX is in the works. That is according to an exclusive in the Wall Street Journal this week. And one of the authors of that exclusive is aviation reporter Benjamin Katz. He joins me now. Ben, thanks very much for coming on the program. Tell us first of all, what do we know and how far along is this?
It's pretty early days, but what we know is that Boeing, under their new CEO took over in August last year. Under the new CEO, Boeing is working on a successor to the 737 MAX. Now, on the face of it, maybe, the scale and the impact of this news, isn't immediately clear. The 737 MAX is part of the 737 family. It's been around for, 60 years, and Boeing is looking at replacing it. Now, this is essentially a bet that Boeing is making. It'll take a decade for them to get right, to figure out, to do all the development work. But eventually, it is the next big thing for Boeing. And in that sense, it's kind of them throwing the gauntlet at the feet of Airbus. It's them saying, we've been through this run of crises, but we're not down and out. We're working on something new, something, that they'll hope is spectacular, and that'll start winning back some of the market share that they've lost in this kind of duopolistic rivalry they have with Airbus in Europe.
And this is obviously a big deal, but not one that they have announced yet. They're keeping it under wraps for the moment. Is that because they don't want to be seen as, say, losing focus on the whole current recovery plan thing?
That's what we understand. The communication from Kelly Ortberg, the Boeing CEO, has been pretty clear and very consistent since he took over. We are not being distracted by future projects. We're not being distracted by anything except for the core, which is to get through the current run of crises. And when we talk about these crises, we talk about quality issues with aircraft, coming out of their factories. We're talking about delayed aircraft. There are still 2 models of the 737 MAX that haven't even yet started delivery. They're still waiting for certification approval before they can even get that going. So I think strategically, it's difficult for Boeing and the new CEO to be talking excitedly about a new project when they have so much work to do right here and now.
And at the same time, the Boeing 737 MAX is frankly somewhat infamous at this point. Will there be a calculation, I guess, from Boeing when they're looking at the future that perhaps the only way that they can get over the public trust problem long term is by building an entirely new plane?
I think it's gotten to a point where, as I mentioned, Boeing initially built the 737 back in the 60s, right? And after they built the original Boeing 737, they then upgraded it, a couple decades later. They released Boeing NG, or Next Generation, and then they did a third upgrade, which was the 737 MAX. And with that third upgrade, they really stretched the capability, just the physical aerodynamics of the plane, that kind of contributed to, some of the, a big part of this crisis, and definitely, the 2 crashes that we know about from 2018 and 2019. So kind of stretching, doing more with the current model, with the current kind of airframe, with the current aerodynamics of it, kind of feels like they've done probably more than they should have already. And so this would be them starting from scratch, essentially, taking an entirely new concept and bringing that to life, and really setting their goal, their strategy for, the decades to come. This will be the core aircraft in their portfolio.
Just to follow up on that, Ben, when you talk about the development problems that did exist, obviously a lot of this came out because of the crashes as well. Do I understand then that from your understanding, part of the issue with that development was the fact that they were expanding the use, building on top of building for the 737 MAX? Would there be something easier about restarting the development process with a new plane?
Yes, definitely. If you think back to the 60s and you compare it to what we have now, the engines are just a completely different beast. I mean, they still technically work in similar ways, but they're much bigger, they're much more powerful, they provide much more thrust. And so you really have, this current generation, the 737 MAX, using an engine technology that was, built in the last 10, 20 years on an airframe that was built 60 years ago. So there's kind of a mismatch there. If they pick up with this new project starting from scratch, they can design an airframe that not only is, caters towards the current generation and the next generation of engines, but can also be ready to, be equipped with future engines and kind of think about it a bit more, protectively as they look to expand and, go towards the latter part of the century.
And at the same time, even if in theory this might be easier in some ways to start from scratch, as we're talking about here, do you expect anything to change in the development process? Has Boeing learned anything based on all the investigations that they've done, the sort of, the recovery plan that they're under right now? Do you expect that to change how they go about this development of a new plane?
I think there are a lot of big questions. I mean, you're totally right. It's a very important point. When they were developing the 737 MAX, there were obvious issues that came out later about their relationship with the Federal Aviation Administration. So with the FAA, their regulator, what those dynamics were like. That process has completely changed now. And Boeing and the FAA are going to have to figure out effectively, how to do this in a way that that the public accepts, that kind of honors the role of regulator and regulated, so to speak. I think the other important thing is in the past, Boeing has typically been very outspoken and kind of excitable about new projects and new programs. They've, when you think back to the 787, that was, flagged long in advance before they actually ended up formally launching it. They also discussed a new aircraft called the 797. That was kind of the branded nickname, the rumor, the NMA. That aircraft also spoke about a lot and eventually was scrapped. I think this, at the moment, kind of signals a slightly different approach from Boeing, one where they're not kind of going all in, making the big noise about it, but rather, do the work, make sure that we've got something special, and then we can start talking about it, and then hopefully get it to market as quickly as possible.
Benjamin Katz, aviation reporter for the Wall Street Journal, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing. I'm Chris Chermak, and it's time now for a roundup of business headlines. For that, I'm joined by Bloomberg's Ewan Potts. Ewan, great to have you back on the show. We're going to start with gold, which is at another record high today. This is always sort of a good news, bad news story, isn't it, when gold is doing well? What's fueling the demand this time?
Yeah, it certainly is. Hello, Chris. It's been quite the run for the yellow metal. Gold hitting another all-time high today, rallying for a fifth day. Now, gold loves uncertainty, and the news from Washington that the US government is shutting down today, the first shutdown in 7 years, is another thing for markets to worry about. The key data that the Federal Reserve and investors rely on is also likely to be hit with the stats agencies caught up in the slowdown. So that's a bit of a worry. The rally we've seen in the last few days just adds to the phenomenal year that it's been for gold. It's actually on course for its best year since 1979, and it is up almost 50% since January. It's been pushed along by strong buying from central banks around the world and from rising holdings in gold-backed exchange-traded funds. And behind the scenes, falling interest rates and worries about the future path of inflation, well, they've really been key tailwinds for bullion.
Ewan, our first guest, Jacob, did also mention the risk that government borrowing costs could rise. You mentioned with gold at a record high because of the government shutdown. Is there any signs there that you're seeing in the markets that borrowing costs are under threat too?
Well, I mean, the amount of indebtedness of governments around the world is, I think, a key underlying worry for investors. If you think about some of the long-term risks, broadly speaking, around the world, consumers are not particularly indebted at the moment, and companies aren't either. There's been a decent period of profitability for companies, and their indebtedness levels are not at kind of critical levels. But a lot of the world's governments have borrowed a huge amount of money and are continuing to borrow a huge amount of money. The US government is in debt to the tune of some $35 trillion, and we know that borrowing in Europe is way above the target set by the EU agreements as well. The UK here, we have a debt of 100% of GDP. So, of course, if governments are issuing more and more debt, the cost of that debt, the interest rate of that debt tends to go up. And at some point, that merry-go-round is going to stop spinning. But, of course, nobody knows quite when it's going to be.
Ewan, some other news to ask you about. There's some research that is suggesting AI is not yet, at least, taking all of our jobs.
Yeah, well, there are plenty of people forecasting that AI is set to rapidly eliminate vast swathes of white-collar jobs in the next few years. There was a recent study by Goldman Sachs estimating that AI adoption could displace 6 to 7% of the US workforce, although they said it wouldn't happen all at once. But new research suggests the mass adoption of ChatGPT, incidentally less than 3 years old, by the way, is not yet having a major effect on the jobs market. Now, the work was done by economists at Yale University and the Brookings Institution think tank and reported in the FT today. One of the researchers says that the labour market, they're talking about the US here, doesn't feel great. So it feels correct that AI is taking people's jobs. But they say they've looked at this many, many different ways, and they really cannot find any sign that this is happening. And they also did some really interesting look at how fast the occupation mix is changing in the US labour market. And the analysis suggests that ChatGPT is rapidly changing the mix of occupations on offer to tech workers. But when it comes to the wider economy, it's actually only shifting the composition of jobs slightly faster than the arrival of the internet or even the adoption of computers back in the 1980s. So perhaps this is not having the very rapid effect that we thought it would, and maybe it's all not going to turn out as badly as people fear.
We'll see what happens, but crazy that it's only been 3 years since ChatGPT came into our lives. Ewan Potts, Bloomberg reporter, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing, and it's time now for what we've all been waiting for, the results of that annual competition known as Fat Bear Week in Alaska's Katmai National Park. It's a competition that pits brown bear against brown bear who are really just trying to mind their own business and bulk up by eating salmon ahead of their winter hibernation, but instead have the world's prying eyes judging them from webcams, voting on their girth and their beauty. And who better to tell us about who won this year's Fat Bear Beauty Contest but Monocle's Bear Desk Chief Laura Kramer. Laura, the Cubs won yesterday, but those are not the type of bears we're talking about.
Yes, Chris, the merely chubby have been removed, and we have a new monarch of Brooks River, as you mentioned. It's the annual bracket-style competition that pits different wild bears against each other, and the public were left with a true clash of the titans because these competitors, Chris, they looked like massive, fluffy bowling balls with ears, and it was a competition that attracted more than 1.5 million votes, more than ever before. And the winner is Chunk. Yes, with almost 100,000 votes, Chunk won. It's his first title.
It's his first title, and you do have to toot your own horn a little bit here, Laura. Did you predict this one as you did last year's?
In fact, I did. I did predict it. Well, it's a gift. What can I say? I messaged our deputy head of radio and the producer of this program, Tom Webb, late last night with my prediction, and so it is all written down, so it is official. Let me tell you a little bit about
anyone
Chunk.
Wondering, there is a written record of this prediction.
I am a serious journalist after all. Now, Chunk is known as the most dominant dominant brown bear of the river. He won the fatness competition despite the fact that he suffered from most of the season, really, with a potentially fatal broken jaw. We don't know exactly how the injury happened, but locals predict that it was probably a fight over another female with another male. Now, despite this, he pushed through. And as we know, in sports and competition, the people love an underdog story. We want to see champions who triumph over adversity. It makes us feel like we can overcome our own struggles, doesn't it? And what's more compelling to the audience than the ultimate battle, which is for survival?
It certainly does, but I mean, I hate to be the nitpicker here, Laura, but does this suggest that maybe, just maybe, this isn't about the science of the actual fattest bear? It's a little more about, who captures our hearts?
A popularity contest? Yes, of course. These are wild bears, Chris. You can't just go up and weigh them. You'd become part of the diet rather than the salmon. So yeah, it's all based on before and after photos of the bears, of their weight gain as they prepare for winter, as well, I should say, as their personalities, because, people get quite attached to them. They gain about 4 pounds a day during this. So that's just under 2 kilograms as it's all happening. And there's a live stream on the website and people get very defensive about who they want to see as the official fat bear of the year. There's also some controversy because some bears didn't have names. So Chunk did. He's one of them. Some of them just go by numbers. And you have to imagine there are about 2,200 brown bears in this park. So it'd be a really big task to name them all. But they think it's unfair because if you've got a name versus a number, people are naturally going to go. And there was one that the people really liked, which was Flotato was his name. He didn't fare very well. But there you go. There's controversy around that.
I get this. I know it's like Bear 856, I believe, was in the final. That's not quite as exciting, but did beat last year's champion Grazer. A little bit of an ode to Grazer. It was the last female bear left in the competition.
Yes, that's right. Returning champion Grazer was kicked out in the semis. As you mentioned, last female bear standing this year. And, after some back-to-back wins, I think people wanted to see a new champion take it. And I'll have you know, there's quite some controversy here because Grazer and Chunk actually have history. He killed one of her cubs last year. And due to all the cameras, it was all caught on the live stream and people were very mad about it. And they say, it probably helped Grazer win last year. The sympathy vote really helped. And so there was actually some resentment this time around. Many people refused to vote for Chunk because of that. In solidarity with Grazer, somebody tweeted, "If you vote for Chunk, you are a fascist." So people take it very seriously. It makes Chunk's win that much more dramatic, I think, from villain to flab chab.
and it does bring us back to my opening because then there is a link to the Cubs. You didn't take it all to my baseball reference of the Chicago Cubs at the top of this bit.
As a long-suffering Cubs fan, we have to take what we can get, Chris. It's not a great existence for us always.
You never know what might happen this year. Laura Kramer, Monocle's desk bear chief, who also just happens to be our senior producer in her spare time. Thank you very much for joining us. That's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Tom Webb. Our researcher was Daniela Bra-Smith. And our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Termack. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.